of the ASEAN. In this first segment, we're going to talk about a visit of the Prime Minister of China to Australia, announcing China's inclusion of Australia in the unilateral visa-free countries. On the other hand, the Premier of Malaysia is planning to join the BRICS group in emerging economies, signaling a strategic economic shift. Also, the China Coast Guard conducted its inaugural boarding inspection of a Philippine vessel in the South China Sea for illegal entry. And in retaliation for EU's AV tariff, Beijing's new anti-doping investigation could raise tariff on EU port. Let's see.
China Current is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started.
Welcome to China Currents, your weekly news report of what's happening in China. I'm Lisa. In this episode, Chinese Premier visited Australia, announcing China's inclusion of Australia in its unilateral visa-free countries. Malaysia's Prime Minister plans to join the BRICS grouping of emerging countries, signaling a strategic economic shift. The China Coast Guard conducted its inaugural boarding inspection of a Philippine vessel in the South China Sea for illegal entry. In retaliation for EU's EV tariff, Beijing's new anti-dumping investigation could raise tariffs on EU pork. Also, a Chinese video game topped global sales. Black Myth: Wukong, developed by Game Science, surpasses Counter-Strike 2 on Steam. Let's start today's episode with a significant move for international relations. Chinese Premier Li Qiang arrived in Adelaide on June 15th, marking the start of his official visit to Australia. In a landmark announcement, Premier Li declared that China will include Australia in its list of unilateral visa-free countries. The visa, the first by a Chinese premier in 7 years, signifies a return to normalcy in bilateral relations after years of tension. Analysts noted that this development follows Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's successful visit to China last year, which helped to realign the two nations after a period of strained ties. Premier Li's visit coincided with the 10th anniversary of the China-Australia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. He expressed his eagerness for in-depth discussion with Australian leaders and citizens on a variety of topics, including cooperation and development. Premier Li said, "We agreed to provide each other with reciprocal access to 5-year multiple entry visas for tourism, business, and visiting family members. China will also include Australia in its visa waiver program." Adelaide is the second stop of Premier Li's 3-nation tour, following his visit to New Zealand. During his 4-day stay in Australia, he and Prime Minister Albanese co-chaired the 9th China-Australia Annual Leaders Meeting and participated in the China-Australia CEO Roundtable. Prime Minister Albanese described it as an important opportunity to engage directly on key bilateral issues, emphasizing the importance of maintaining a stable and direct relationship with China. Australian Assistant Defence Minister and Trade Minister echoed this sentiment, highlighting the need for stability and willingness on both sides to remove impediments to the relationship. Professor Yu Lei from Shandong University suggests that this shows the current Australian government has recognized that the previous government went too far in handling Australia's relations with China, ultimately damaging the interests of the Australian people. However, while proactive measures are being taken, challenges remain. As a NATO member and ally of the US, there are still certain difficulties in security concerns between the two sides, especially in the advancement of the AUKUS. Next up, another significant development on the international stage. Malaysia is planning to join the BRICS grouping of emerging economies. This announcement comes directly from Malaysia's Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim. In an interview with Chinese media outlet, Prime Minister Anwar revealed that Malaysia will soon begin the formal process of joining BRICS, pending feedback from South Africa. He stated, "We have made our policy clear and we have made our decision. We will start the formal process soon. As far as the Global South is concerned, we are fully supportive. BRICS, founded in 2006, initially included Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This January, the bloc expanded to welcome Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE. Anwar also supported comments made by Brazilian President Luiz Lula, criticizing the dominance of the US dollar in international trade. Anwar expressed frustration over currency attacks, emphasizing that such dominance contradicts basic economic principle. He remarked, "Last year, Malaysia had the highest investment ever, but the currency was still attacked. It goes against basic economic principles," criticizing the US dollar's dominance as an international currency. Anwar praised China's rise, highlighting it as a source of global balance. He commended Chinese President Xi Jinping for his focus on rejuvenating Asian values and civilization, noting that he was attracted to President Xi for being one of the few leaders who talk about civilization, making him unique. He called for a broader perspective on history and expressed the need for independent countries to voice their views freely. Anwar remarked that the excessive focus on one event ignores decades of history and is a problem with Western discourse. These comments come ahead of Chinese Premier Li Qiang's visit to Malaysia, marking the 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties between the two nations. During Li's 3-day visit, Malaysia and China are expected to renew a 5-year economic cooperation agreement and sign deals in the digital economy and green development. Next up, the China Coast Guard has conducted its first ever boarding inspection of a Philippine vessel that had illegally entered the South China Sea. On June 17th, despite prior commitments, the Philippines sent 3 ships into the waters near Renai Reef in the Nanshan Islands, attempting to deliver supplies to an illegally grounded military ship. During this operation, the Philippine supply ship deliberately collided with a Chinese vessel. After repeated warnings were ignored, the China Coast Guard boarded and inspected the Philippine vessels. The action by the China Coast Guard has drawn condemnation from the Philippine Armed Forces. However, reports indicate that China Coast Guard had issued multiple warnings regarding the Philippine incursion near Renai Reef. The first warning came at 4:43 a.m., revealing that the China Coast Guard had taken regulatory measures against Philippine vessels according to the law. The second report indicated that at 5:59 a.m., the Philippine supply ship had ignored multiple stern warnings from the Chinese side, violating International Maritime Coalition regulations, and deliberately approached Chinese vessels in a dangerous and unprofessional manner, resulting in a collision. The responsibility for the incident lies entirely with the Philippine side. Gang Yu, spokesperson for the China Coast Guard, stated that the boarding inspection was conducted in accordance with the law and followed professional standards. On June 15th, new regulation for the administrative enforcement procedures of the China Coast Guard came into effect. These regulations grant the China Coast Guard the authority to use lethal force against foreign vessels that refuse to leave China's territorial waters. Lin Jian, spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, reiterated that China is committed to resolving maritime disputes through negotiations with directly involved parties, but will respond firmly to any maritime provocations. Dr. Ding Duo, Deputy Director of the Maritime Law and Policy Research Institute at the National Institute for South China Sea Studies, points out that in early May, the China Coast Guard conducted maritime rescue training, demonstrating China's preparedness for emergencies and cautioned the Philippines against underestimating China's resolve. He stressed that China has a clear red line in the South China Sea dispute and is fully prepared for any contingencies. Next up, China has launched an anti-dumping investigations into pork imports from the European Union. This move comes after the EU decided to impose new tariff on Chinese electrical vehicles. The investigation could lead to higher tariff on EU pork products, impacting major exporters like Spain, the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, and France. Currently, China imposes a 12% tariff on EU meat import. Analysts warn that an increase to 20% could significantly affect European exporters, who might struggle to offset losses even with new markets such as Vietnam and the Philippines. China's Ministry of Commerce announced on Monday that the investigation will target various pork products imported from the EU for human consumption. This includes fresh, dried, smoked, preserved, cold, and frozen whole cut, as well as pig intestines, stomachs, and bladders. The ministry has urged those affected by the alleged dumping to contact the Trade Remedy and the Investigation Bureau within 20 days to join the investigation. In 2023, China consumed 57.94 million tons of pork and pork byproduct, importing only 1.55 million tons. About half of these imports came from Europe. The Chinese financial news outlet reported that the drop in EU pork supply is not expected to significantly impact pork prices in China. However, many EU pig farms could suffer due to difficulties in finding new buyers for products not commonly used in European cuisine. Last year, Spain exported approximately 160,000 tons of pork products worth 1.2 billion euros to China. Following the investigation launch, Spain has called for trade talks. Spanish Agriculture Minister expressed hope for negotiations to avoid tariffs on Spanish agriculture products. The Netherlands and Denmark, which exported pork products worth $620 million and $550 million respectively in 2023, will also be affected. Commentators suggest that the rising demand for pork in China provides Beijing with leverage in trade negotiations with the EU. If necessary, China may consider increasing pork imports from Brazil and Russia. Next up, a Chinese video game has topped the global sale chart. Black Myth: Wukong, an action RPG developed by Chinese studio Game Science, has dethroned Counter-Strike 2 to become the highest grossing product on Steam for the week of June 4th to 11th. Game Science opened pre-orders for Black Myth: Wukong after debuting a new trailer at the Summer Game Fest 2024, reminding fans that the game is set to launch on August 20th. Currently, it's the most wish-listed upcoming title worldwide. As of June 17th, over 1.15 million people have pre-ordered the game, generating over 300 million RMB in sales, even at the lowest price point. The game's story is based on one of the 4 great classic novels of Chinese literature, 西游记, or Journey to the West, published in the 16th century during the Ming Dynasty and attributed to Wu Cheng'en. This epic tale spans 100 chapters and follows Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, who can pull a spear from his ear and is one of the protagonists of the story. Black Myth: Wukong is deeply rooted in Chinese mythology with the titular Wukong. Let's stay tuned for more updates on this highly anticipated game. And that's all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Current. And if you have any thoughts and comments about our show, please reach us at the email address below. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from you. See you next time.
We will go for a short break, but we'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to China Now. In the second segment, we have Global Arena with Charles Liu talking about the problems caused by the tensions between India and China. Moreover, in Thinkers Forum, we have Dom Debor, a journalist and current affairs commentator, talking about how the media shapes the way that we view the world. Let's see.
Major Indian press, Hindustan Times, reported, quoting from Economic Times of India, that the tension between China and India and the problems that the tension has created has brought about for the Indian electronics industry $15 billion in losses. In addition, and this is, I think, even more significant and more painful, loss of 100,000 jobs. Now, India wants to grow. India wants to develop. India wants to become a dominant force, not only in Asia, but in the world. But at the same time, it's trying to do this by blocking out Chinese companies, Chinese investments, Chinese suppliers, and creating very difficult conditions, including blocking visas for Chinese workers going to India, Chinese engineers, Chinese investors. Can they do it without Chinese support or the Chinese suppliers and the Chinese investments that have flooded into India over the last decade? I think it's very difficult. And this is something beginning to be recognized by the media in India as well, naming 100,000 job loss. Now this is in a population of 1.4 billion, it may not seem significant, but this is actually industrial jobs. This is actually jobs that creates higher value, farm workers. So 100,000, the significance can be much, much higher than 100,000 job loss in the countryside. I think India has to come to grips with the issue of running or growing together with China rather than blocking China out to protect its own industries. China has gone through the process and has succeeded in creating ever higher value products, going up the supply chain, going up the value chain, and going up the technology chain. I think India should come to grips with this. China is not trying to demolish India. China is not trying to compete with India. I think there's very little that India can do in competing with China in manufacturing in the world today. I think India would be wise to try to join the China supply chain and become part of a much bigger market, including the Chinese market and the ASEAN market. It's very clear the ASEAN countries, including countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand, have happily joined the supply chain in China and also happily gained, therefore, also access to the Chinese market. Not only are they moving quickly in this market integration and supply chain integration with the Chinese market and the Chinese supply chain, their infrastructure is becoming more efficiently adapted to the Chinese infrastructure, including the new rail lines that's being built. Of course, Indonesia has adopted the Chinese standard of high-speed rail, but Vietnam and Cambodia and so on are now also adopting Chinese rail standards. Transportation can be a much more sophisticated network between China and the ASEAN countries, which will, of course, also enhance the efficiency of the supply chain. I think India should also consider doing the same, rather than blocking out Chinese investors, Chinese companies, or, as is known to many, that the business environment of imposing fines, freezing cash accounts of Chinese companies doesn't really induce or encourage Chinese investment into India. There was an article in Bloomberg on this very same subject, or part of this subject. The title of the article is "Modi's Jobs Crisis Can't Be Solved Without China." And it's interesting that Western press, like Bloomberg, is now identifying this problem or this issue. The article basically refers to the job crisis in India, with such a huge young population seeking advancement in their careers and creating the need to create higher value jobs to accommodate them. Now, the article basically refers to the fact that without Chinese investment, without Chinese companies, establishment of manufacturing or industrial jobs, it's going to be very difficult for Modi to accommodate the needs of creating higher value jobs for the young population in India. So This ties into what we were talking about before in terms of not only creating a greater market, also creating more industrial jobs, higher value jobs. And this is something that even the Western press is now beginning to address.
The U.S. entered the post-World War II period with absolutely two different kinds of approaches. One was to build a true international law and international institutions, and the second was to be a superpower. These were always in some conflict with each other. But there was a time, for a long time, I would say, where the UN was respected by American politics. And the idea was we should strengthen the UN and UN agencies. The US had a lot to do with building a lot of the UN agencies like the World Health Organization and others after World War II. But over time, as US power increased, and especially at the end of the Soviet Union, when the US strategists said, you know, we're the sole superpower, we have no challengers, we can do what we want. Then they started to look at the United Nations merely as a nuisance. And here were all these new post-colonial countries saying we need a fair international system, and the United States would say, don't talk to us about fairness, we'll decide what fairness is. And so over time, the US political elite started to view the UN maybe as a place to spread US propaganda, but not as a vehicle of global problem solving. And if you look at objective data, the US is the country in the world probably least aligned with the UN Charter right now. I've created with my colleagues a multilateralism index to see who actually sides with the global majority, who actually follows the UN institutions, who signs UN treaties and so on. The US comes out at the end of the list, not at the front, at the back, the least aligned country with the UN Charter. What the US started to do was to say, we will create an alliance. We will create a group of allies and friends. So this became the expression, not the UN, but allies and friends, allies and friends, allies and friends. And this meant military allies, of course. This meant NATO. And the mindset is completely us versus them. It's the US versus China. How dare China be so large and successful? We're the only superpower. So that became the US mindset. Now, it would be a tragedy if China took the view, well, the US has its alliance, now we'll have our alliance. In other words, dividing the world in two. Probably China would have the larger part of world population and so on. You look at the BRICS today, for example, they are about 36% of world output compared to 29% of world output of the G7 countries. But the idea should not be the US has its alliance, we need our alliance for our security or to save the world from the US alliance. In my opinion, but a strongly held view, I'm hoping that China will continue to do what it's been doing, to say the US has its allies and friends, we have the UN Charter, we have international law, we want multilateralism of everyone, including the US. We don't want to have two blocks. We don't want block politics, because I believe China's statecraft is fundamentally different from Western statecraft. Western statecraft is always us versus them. It's always a fight. It's always a war of all against all. If you listen to the realists, it's an anarchic world system, the way they call it, because they say there's no overarching power, so it's anarchy. But Confucian thought is something very different. Confucian thought is that's not anarchy, you need virtue. you need principles to live, and that can be what holds us together. So we don't need one dominant power. We don't need one hegemon. We need decency. We need virtue. We need proper behavior. This is what I hope China leads the world in showing, that this, quote, realist model is not the only model of statecraft. The idea of war of all against all is not the only model. And that, in fact, and I'll just summarize here, the United Nations will be 80 years old next year. That's not a lot of time in human history. We've only had 1 century so far of attempting international law. It started with the League of Nations, which didn't work. Now we have the UN, which is very fragile, and the US has increasingly turned its back on its own creation. But I don't want to give up on the UN. And I believe that for China's interest, by the way, interest as well as its vision, a strong UN system is the right kind of system. The United States does not recognize the doctrine of non-intervention. The United States is the #1 user of sanctions, not UN sanctions, US unilateral sanctions. That is intervention in other countries' affairs. The United States funds agencies like the National Democratic Institute and others to actually get into the internal politics of other countries. Are you kidding? Handle our own politics. We have enough problems agreeing on anything inside the United States. Don't meddle in the internal affairs of other countries. And the United States has 750 overseas military bases. What I propose is we end all overseas military bases, all of them. You know, if your naval vessel needs refurbishing in a naval yard, doesn't have to be an overseas naval base to do it. We could get along better if we didn't have all of this massive 80 countries of overseas U.S. military bases, where the U.S. meddles in the internal politics just about every place where it has a military base, because then the U.S. strategy says, oh, we don't want to get kicked out of here. We need a government that doesn't want to throw us out. But this government says, we don't want you here. Oh, maybe we have to have a regime change operation in this country. And so this is very destabilizing. China can be, should be a bulwark along with all the rest, and teach the U.S. also, abide by international law, abide by the doctrine of non-intervention, abide by virtue and harmony in international relations. It doesn't have to be a war of all against all. It should be harmony, because we have enough to do together that we don't need this constant provocation, which is unfortunately what has become U.S. foreign policy.
People have a lot of opinions and no facts, and that's basically what it is. They're so connected to the media. I was born in 1954. I turned 5 in 1959, started school then, went through, secondary school over in 1972, and then studied, from there on. When I was 5 years old, my parents would not allow us to have a television set. We didn't have one. They wanted us to read. So my contact with the real world, or with the world as I was being socialized, consisted of reading, the radio, mostly music, and a little bit of news. The reading was mostly newspapers and then books, because I read everything. And just people, like actual person-to-person contact. There was no virtual contact. It was all real, with the exception of reading and sound. As I got older, we kind of fed into the paradigm that developed. We were kind of late stage. People my age, other people my age mostly, grew up in front of a television set. And they're different. Their understanding of things is different. Now, there's an immersion in all of the technology And the socialization now of kids, say for the last 10, 15 years even, there's through these little boxes. My nieces sit next to each other on a couch and nobody says a word. They all, type there. So in other words, their socialization is virtual. So the people that come out of school, college, grad school, professional law school, I've trained law school students, for example, on different things. Their understanding of the world is, in a sense, very shallow. And they take a great deal of claims at face value as if they're true. And so if all they're hearing about China is China's killing Uyghurs, China's trying to make Muslims become atheists and all of this nonsense, if that's all they're hearing, that's the universe for them. That's what they honestly believe. So when we're talking about this, I'm sorry to go this long circle. I just want to give you an understanding of my perspective. When we're talking about what do people think here or something, the first reflex I have is to say they're not thinking. I can't tell you what to think. They'll tell you something if you ask a question, but I don't think there's an actual thought process involved. I don't think they're taking this fact and testing them and synthesizing and comprehending something at all. I think it's something quite different that's inserted into them that comes out when you push the print button. That said, what will come out of their mouth is almost exactly what the media tells them. People that see all of the work that I do, and they pat me on the back for it and such, my family, my friends, whatever, will then turn around when I say I'm going to China and say, are you going to be safe? Like I was in Siberia as an election inspector last month. And I've been to Russia twice before that, once for a month. And when I told my friends, I'm going, they were genuinely worried about my safety. And the same with China. They think I'm going to end up in a re-education camp or some crazy, I'm serious. This is what they believe. Lots of people believe this myth here, but it's really difficult to even call it a belief because it isn't that deep. If I took one of these people with me on a trip to China, there would be an apostle here preaching China because it would be such a revelation to them that, things were so different than they believed before that now they have to believe this, whatever it is. It's pretty scary when you consider this is the engine behind the U.S. military and intelligence apparatus and sort of the top structure or part of the top structure of the whole empire, that they can do just about anything and not really face a threat from the people here. I see what's this stuff going on in Georgia today. To me, it looks like the U.S. intel is trying to do another Maidan. They've got this the Foreign Agent Registration Act that the government wants to regulate some of the nonprofits that are in the country, like CIA. And the government, which is kind of captive, the elements of it are kind of captive of the West already, and the outside, and these nonprofits are tying, and the EU are dangling the possibility of Georgia joining the EU, which some people make a lot of money if that happens. But they're tying it to this law and basically telling the people of Georgia that if this law regulating these nonprofits is passed, you'll never get in the EU. And it's the same thing that happened in Ukraine. It was used as bait to organize this anti-government, protest. First of all, if you can understand anything, you should always have multiple alternative presentations of fact to consider. If I tell you someone is 5'11" and I tell you nothing else about them, you really don't know anything about them. Now go find him. He's 5 foot. Person is 5'11". Is it a he or a she? Do they weigh 5 pounds or 500 pounds? Do they limp on their left leg? The more data you have, the larger your data set, the more of an understanding you have about things. Here, across the board, and this is a phenomenon that I watched it develop. When I was 5 years old, I used to go to the store over the course of the day. In New York City, there were 6, 7 daily newspapers, and then there was a local one where I was in Irvington, New York, and then Ossining, New York. And it was my job to go assemble them as they came in, pick up the morning papers, pick up the afternoon paper, pick up the evening paper, because they came that way, and leave them for my father to read. I read them all myself. I learned the second or third day that I did that I had to fold them back just so and whatever. And so each of these papers, you would see stories, some big ones. Like I remember what they call the Cuban Missile Crisis here, for example, when in October 1962. I was 8 years old. I remember reading the Journal American, the Daily News, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Herald Tribune, and the Daily Mirror. they were talking about different things. On some issues like that, there was a unity of, I'll call it now, ideological perspective with respect to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet Union was wrong, Cuba is evil, and we're right. That was true across the spectrum of coverage. But there were some very significant differences in the narrative and also in which facts were presented in different papers. And you also had multiplicity of television stations later, like this existed then. I didn't see it, but from 65 on, I saw it. We had CBS, NBC, ABC, something called Metro Media, which is now Fox, something else that was adjacent to the Daily News and Chicago Tribune, and then a PBS, a public station. Each one had their own news department, and each of the news departments presented what they thought was important. Sometimes there was a story in one that wasn't in any of the others, and it was of some significance. Other times they all covered the same story, but they told, different tales. This changed over time, and I was watching it close. I was from the, say, 1978 forward, I was involved as a public access television producer. In 1978, 79, while this was starting, saw that and got involved. And so from there, I was watching both the law around communications and also the practice and the business that was going on. During the 80s, shortly after I got involved, Ronald Reagan removed a regulation that was called the Fairness Doctrine that put a public service requirement on the private carriers. Most media in the United States privately owned, even though you had the idea that these holders of these licenses to broadcast should not be able to control or dominate the public discussion. So if they're going to present some controversial issue or someone that's presenting a controversial issue, they have to give equal time and prominence in terms of placement in their programming to someone of the opposite view. Now, I realize in reality it's not binary like that, and what they did was a binary system. That was called the Fairness Doctrine. That was the extent of public involvement in the broadcasting. They eliminated that in the 80s. In the 90s, both the rise of the internet and all kinds of social media starting to bud, they negotiated an entirely new regime for telecommunications in the United States called the Telecommunications Act of 1996. This was Bill Clinton and Al Gore and what are now the tech giants. And what that did was place control of the internet in the hands of these, in essence, private interests. I mean, you have internet, you have Google and Microsoft and all these monsters. And as these things happened, the ownership of the newspapers, where I had 7, now there's 2, and they're owned by the same company, and the New York Times, so there's 3, because the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post are both owned by Murdoch, for example. And those 2 and the New York Times are the New York City newspapers now. I mean, there's little inconsequential ones, but that's it. Same happened with television. You now have Fox, CNN, MSNBC. That's essentially, and then CBS and ABC and NBC. That's essentially the media landscape. I think the first time I really noticed it, which was before the 96 Telecom Act, was in the propaganda for the first war in Iraq in 1990/91, where no matter where you turned, everyone was talking about tying yellow ribbons around trees and incubator babies and the whole bit. There wasn't really a dissenting voice anywhere. You know what? We used to have our televisions had stations in New York, metropolitan New York, channel 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11, and 13. 7 stations. You'd had 6, 7 distinct points of view at that time. We now have hundreds of television stations, and with the internet outside of private, regular citizens, an infinite number of television stations, all saying one thing. One thing. They all say one thing. And that's our entire media scape. So it's a tough environment for anything else.
And this was another episode of China Now, a show that opens a window to the present and the future of the Shanghai. And hope you enjoy it. See you next time.